Well, I want to welcome you all to CEO Chick Chat. This is one of the most stellar programs we do at Success in the City. And sometimes they call it the hot seat, but it's the fun seat. In fact, we now have decided, Maureen and I were talking, that we're going to have a show after this in the spring called Survivors. I Survived Chick Chat.
Right.
And we'll host a reception for all our previous
Be on the
survivors.
roof of our building.
So isn't that a great idea? So we'll have Survivor up there. Anyway, it was really made a lot of sense to have Maureen join us to be interviewed. One, she's a woman of incredible accomplishment. Two, she gets it. She gets the women's issue and stepped up immediately and said, we want to be part of the story of women climbing the ladder of success. And we have a lot in common in that we're both baby boomers. We're both of that kind of generation. So I think we're going to have an interesting conversation about our experience growing up. So as we always begin, let's go back to the beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in New York, in the Bronx, New York, and I lived, our family lived in the projects in the Gun Hill Road section of the Bronx until I was 5 years old. And then they moved to a little bungalow over by Dyer Avenue and 233rd Street. And rumor has it that I used to have a New York accent, and I used to say 233rd Street, but I lost it.
Really? When did you lose your accent? Was it real strong for a long time?
I don't think it was as strong as the rest of my family, but I definitely lost it in college. When I remember calling home, and my father answered the phone, and my last name is Dwyer, and he answered the phone, Pete Dwyer. And I thought, Dwyer? That's not how you say our name. And I realized that I probably had a New York accent, so I went overboard and corrected for it.
Interesting, interesting. Do you think that was a good thing that you did that? Do you think it helped you in your career?
Definitely, because I know what my impression, I hope no one in here has a New York accent, but I know what my impression is of a New York accent when I hear it, so I'm glad I tempered mine.
Excellent. Well,
I do slip back when I go back to visit my family. They're still in New York.
I'm from Texas, and when I have a drink, it's like, oh my God, I love you.
You sweet thing.
You sweet thing, yeah. Which is why everybody goes, get her to drink. So you started in the Bronx. Your parents were married. Where are you in the birth order?
I'm the second oldest, one of 6 children. I have an older brother who's a year older, and then I have 3 younger sisters and a younger brother.
So that's an interesting dynamic, having 6 kids in a family.
Yes.
And being number 2.
Yes. And because I was the oldest girl, I was kind of like the oldest child. And my brother got away with a lot that I didn't get away with, so.
It's kind
but I don't resent him for it. We don't hold grudges.
Well, I think boys were kind of, in our generation, boys had more permissions
they did.
than girls did.
They did.
You know, they just really, parents weren't as concerned about their boys as it was. So now, how long did you guys stay living in the projects in the Bronx? And then where did you go from there?
We were in the projects until I was 5 years old, and that's about when my sister Marion came along. And then the 2-bedroom apartment was too small. My parents moved to this bungalow. And the only thing I remember, well, I remember a lot of things about the projects. And basically, it was a 7-story building, and it was right by the L railroad tracks. And my brother and I used to go to the roof of the building and throw pennies off the building to see if we could hit people with the pennies. That was our entertainment. Not a very good thing for children in those days, but.
So you could have gone a life of crime.
I could have gone a life of crime, yes, absolutely. And I would have had my brother as my partner, so it would have been very easy, but sort of Bonnie and Clyde, but, you know, Maureen and Mike. And then we moved to this 3-bedroom house over by Dyer Avenue and 233rd Street, which was a nice little bungalow and had a little yard. And I actually had a little garden out there in the Bronx. Who would have thought? I grew corn because I'd taken courses at the botanical gardens and gardening, and I grew vegetables. And there were a lot of big families, big Irish families in the neighborhood, and we had relatives around the corner. So it was a very close community. And we stayed there until the 6th child came along, and then my parents felt that having 4 girls in 1 bedroom was probably a bit much. And so they looked for a house outside of the Bronx.
Y'all didn't ever fight or anything, did you?
Never, no, we never fought. We were wonderful, no. Yeah. My brother and I mean, it's interesting how alliances develop. My brother and I were very close growing up, and then my sister Marianne, the 3rd one, had learning disabilities, and we were very close with Marianne. And then the bottom 3 were sort of close. So to the extent that there were differences or grievances, it was usually, you know, the older 3 against the younger 3. And I, in particular, had to spend a lot of time taking care of my younger brothers and sisters. As I got older, whatever I wanted to leave the house in the afternoon and walk into town, the feeling was, if you're going into town, take your sisters and your brother with you. So I was always, you know, I'd meet a boy in town, and I'd have Nancy, Kathy, and Peter with me. They were kind of the chaperone. So my mother was very smart. Yes, yes.
So what did your dad do? What was your dad's career?
My dad was a teacher. He started out teaching 5th grade in schools in the New York City school district, and he taught in the South Bronx. And then as he moved up within the system, he became a supervisor, but he was always involved in the New York public school system.
Education must have then played a large portion of how your family operated.
Education was a huge issue in our family. My father was one of 6 children, and 2 of his sisters were also teachers, so he was a firm believer in education. And I was sort of the model child when it came to having a teacher as a parent. My older brother was very much into sports, and I was the student. And so my father would come home, and he would bring home reading comprehension tests that he'd given his 5th grade class, and he would give them to me even though I was only in 1st or 2nd grade, and he'd do it to see if I could match up with the 5th grade class. And IQ tests, I had my IQ tested so many times by my father growing up. It was just amazing. And he would work with me with my schoolwork and do flashcards with me and flip charts and practice my languages at night. So totally.
Was he doing it with all the kids? Was it
well?
A lot
As I said, my older brother really didn't participate in that. His feeling was, I'm out swimming and running. I'm not really into school as much as Maureen, so I'm going to kind of opt out. So he got a break. And then there was me, and then my sister Marianne had learning disabilities, so she wasn't that good a student. So for the longest time, it was pretty much me and my dad doing all this stuff at night.
So a real interesting dynamic was emerging.
Yes.
In terms of forming a relationship
yes.
with a parent, really a close one. So at this point, what were you thinking in your career? What did you see? Because we're children of that generation where we didn't have the role models that young women have now, that there were so many opportunities. So what did you see your career options at that time?
Well, the role models were really my parents, and my mother was staying at home with 6 children, so I thought, okay, I definitely want to have children and have a family. And my dad being the teacher, I thought, well, I'll just be a teacher. But I was also in Catholic school, and I remember, and this was when I was in the Bronx, so I was probably in 4th or 5th grade, but I think the nuns would do this every year. They would, come into the classroom, and they'd ask all the girls in the class, do you want to be a nun when you grow up? And everybody would raise their hands. And I was like, what? I want children, I want boyfriends, I'm not committing to that yet, no. So I think I knew early on that I didn't want to be a nun. And the next closest thing was probably being a teacher like my dad, and I thought that would probably be a good career path.
That probably was the choices that we young women
right.
really saw then. But I followed I went to a convent for a year.
Did you?
Yeah. Well,
you didn't tell me that.
I know. Well, I'm not on the hot seat.
I can't wait to interview you.
No.
Oh, wait a
minute. No. That's another story, another time. So, but that must have been a really important part of your life there. Now, how long did you stay living in New York? Did you stay there your entire time growing up?
When I was 10, we moved to Bronxville, but it was really Yonkers. The postal address was Bronxville, and we got this great house, and I had a wonderful childhood there. And I stayed there until I went to college. So from the time I was 10 until the time I was 18, I was continued to live in New York, but it was Westchester County. And my dad was still working in the city. And a lot of my jobs in the summer, I was a secretary. My father's theory was, and this is interesting, when my brother and I were probably, in 9th grade, my father decided that we needed to learn typing skills because that would be an asset in getting a job. So both my brother and I went to summer school because we weren't going to waste time in regular school with typing. And we went to typing school, and at the end, when we finished after 6 weeks, I could type. Michael could barely turn on you couldn't turn it on. There was little typewriters. He could do nothing, but he got away with it. But as a result, because I could type, every vacation and every summer I would get a job as a typist or a legal secretary. And a lot of them were in the city, so I would take the train down to the city. And I had a lot of independence doing that, and take the train home and then the bus home. And one of the jobs was down in Greenwich Village. And it was kind of interesting when you're 17 to be working in the city and sort of exploring Greenwich Village and being pretty independent.
That must have been really fascinating to be able to grow up in a city like that. It seems like a lot of people we've talked to, Catherine Weymouth was raised in New York, and she seems like there was a lot of freedom that was afforded, I think, girls and women at that time because of all the transportation. I mean, you really could get anywhere.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the town that we were living in, Bronxville, you would walk to town, it took, 2 minutes, you hop on the train, and 25 minutes you're down in the city. And so a lot of times I would go down on a Sunday and I'd go to one of the museums and just sort of walk around and think, oh, this is kind of cool. I'd kind of like to live in the city. And my father would get tickets sometimes to the ballet or plays, and I was allowed to go down and take my sister with me or my younger brother and go down there for the day. So I had a lot of independence. And I think also being one of 6 children, my mother didn't have a lot of time to pay attention to the older kids once we got old enough to take care of ourselves, and was much more focused on the younger ones. So